In this video, you're going to learn how to build this amazing Next.js portfolio site, which can help you with landing your first job or even landing some additional freelance clients. But instead of learning about it from me, you're going to learn about it from one of the best Next.js instructors on all of YouTube, Hamed Bahram. He has such a great YouTube channel. I'm going to link it in the cards and description for you. And I'm so glad that he's working with me to create this video for you. So if you like this video and his teaching style, I highly recommend checking out his channel.
In this video, we're going to build a portfolio site using Next.js MDX, which is a superset of Markdown. It allows you to write JSX and React components in Markdown. We're going to use Tailwind CSS for styling shadcn UI as our component UI library. And then at the end, we're going to deploy our portfolio to Vercel. So let me show you from high level what we're going to build together. And then we're going to jump into code and build this from scratch. So we have the introduction section up top, and then a recent posts section, which is going to fetch our recent posts. We're going to dive into the individual posts. Each one can have some information, some metadata about the post, such as the image, the title, the publish date, the author, and then some content, which is written in Markdown. We're going to style this using a package from Tailwind called Tailwind Topography. We also are going to add syntax highlighting if you're writing any code. I'm assuming as a developer you would write stuff that has code snippets. There's this all posts page where it fetches all of our blog posts. There's this search functionality built in here for searching for specific titles. The next section is going to be the recent project section. We have some cool little animations on the blog posts. Similar concept of writing the content with some metadata and then Markdown, fetching it here and styling it with Tailwind CSS. The all project page fetches all of our projects. It doesn't have the search, but the same feature. If you wish to add that here, you can follow the same concepts as the posts page. At the bottom, we have the subscribe to my newsletter component that allows somebody to come in here and add their email to subscribe to our newsletter. They're going to get a nice little toast notification from Sonar or from shadcn UI library. And then the last page, other than the footer that we have there with the socials, is our contact page with similar concepts. Somebody can come in here and put in their email. If I can type in my email here and then with a message, and they can contact us. Again, they're going to see some notifications. It is using React Hook Forms, Zod validation. So if they're not providing required fields, they're going to see error messages. This is built with Next.js and server actions, the new way of mutating data or sending or handling form submission inside of Next.js apps. So it's a mini Next.js course in a way that we're going to use a lot of Next.js features. If you have never worked with Next.js, it doesn't require a prior knowledge. I'll try to explain enough so that you can build this with me. There's going to be a link in the description to access the source code, but I would recommend building it from scratch with me rather than copying the source code. Nonetheless, it's going to be an amazing project that we built together here. You're going to end up with a nice portfolio that you can deploy and use it for yourself. So let's dive right in. So we're going to build this from scratch. As I mentioned, we're going to use Next.js. So let's go to Next.js docs and install our Next.js application. This is the command that you're going to be running. Hopefully, as I'm jumping over the docs here and there, it's big enough for you guys to see. So let's pop open our terminal. I'm going to close this and I'm going to use pnpm. You can use npm package manager. So pnpm create and then next app at latest. You can pass in the name of the folder that you want to provide here. I've already created this portfolio folder, so I'm going to say dot, which is a current working directory, and it's going to install this inside of that directory. We're going to use TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind CSS, no source directory. That's just a matter of preference. We're going to use the app router. The @ for import aliases is okay, so we're not going to change that. This is going to go ahead and install a brand new Next.js application for us. I'm going to explain from a high level the structure of our app. If you need help in more details for any of these concepts that I talk about in Next.js, there's going to be individual videos on the channel where you can find more information about that individual concept if you're not feeling comfortable. I'm going to try to keep this as concise as possible so that the video is not that long, but there's going to be detailed videos for any of these concepts. So let's just run pm dev, which is going to run the development server, so we can have a look at what we have here. Okay, so this is the homepage that comes out of the box. Let's just look at the project structure from a high level. We have this root layout. This is the root HTML and body tag that wraps the entire application or all of your pages. We're passing the nested layouts and pages here to the body. We pass in metadata and our fonts here. We have our home page, which is nested here. Anytime you want to create a route in Next.js, you have to export a page.tsx or JSX from that folder or directory. Because we are creating this inside of the app, this is going to be our home page, our index page, or / Anytime we want to create a page, you create a folder and then put a page.tsx inside of it, which we're going to do a ton of here. So don't worry if you haven't done it before. We're going to do this together. So I have created a little note here for myself so that I don't forget what I need to talk about here. So let me close this up. Okay, so let's replace the content of our homepage with a simple component that says home. And then I'm going to put a section here with some padding, let's say padding 24, and then a div with a container class. This is going to center stuff for us, a text 3XL with a font of bold that says, let's say, portfolio. We're going to change this later on just so we are starting from a clean slate here. Now for this container to work, we have to add some config to our Tailwind. But before we do that, let's actually install the prettier config that I usually use in my application. So let's create a prettier RC. This is where you can provide your prettier config. This is how prettier formats your code. So I usually have this here. We're going to install a package that would allow us to use prettier and also sort our Tailwind classes in a nice way. It is called prettier. Let me find it here. It's called prettier plugin for Tailwind. So let's get that. Let me pop up on the terminal here. So let's stop the dev server. pm add. We're going to add prettier itself, and then also prettier plugin Tailwind CSS. This is going to sort our Tailwind classes in a specific way. So no matter how we write it, it always ends up in a similar fashion. It helps when you are working with Tailwind to always sort it in a specific way. It is also very useful when you're working with other developers, and then you're going to have one standard way of sorting these class names, which is going to help you read Tailwind classes or your styling. So we added prettier config, and now if I go ahead and save this, sometimes it needs to be reloaded. Now to reload your pages and then save them again for this to take place, so you can hit Command Shift P or Control Shift P to write some command. You can add reload. Sometimes you need to reload your application for your prettier config to kick in. Sometimes it also helps for your TypeScripters to just kick in and work the way that you are expecting. Now in the next step, let's add shadcn. This is going to be our component library, and then we're going to add this container class to center everything. So let's go to shadcn. If you're not familiar with shadcn, there's going to be links in the description and videos on the channel explaining this UI library. It's not really a UI library in that you have access to the code here, so it's a copy and paste. It's already designed on top of Radix UI, which is a component library, and Tailwind CSS. And the way that it works is that you end up copying the code, the source code for each component that you're using to your application, so you can customize it And because of that, there's not much abstraction. Therefore, it's not a library that you don't have access to the source code. It's just the code that you can copy there. So let's go to installation here, and there's a guide for Next.js as our framework. Assuming that you have already created a Next.js app, you don't have to do this, so you can just go ahead and start from shadcn UI. If you click on this copy, it's going to give you the command for the package manager that you're using. Again, I'm using pnpm, so I would use the pnpm dlx. This is similar to npx, which is going to install packages, shadcn UI at latest, and then init. This is going to initialize a shadcn project. It's going to look at your project structure and then asks you some questions about the settings you want to use for shadcn. The default setting, there's two different styles of designs or themes in shadcn, default and New York. I'm going to choose New York. You can select your gray shade. In Tailwind, we have different gray colors like slate gray, zinc, neutral. I'm going to select zinc, doesn't really matter. Whether or not you want to use CSS variables for your colors, I'm going to select yes. This is going to allow you to add theming to your project if you wanted to. For a portfolio, it may not make sense, but for other projects, it would. Now, this is going to add this components.json that you see here. This is our shadcn config that we just added. It is going to add a component folder, and then any component that you add from shadcn is going to end up inside of a UI folder in this components. We're going to add one for now, just as an example. So for fonts, shadcn is using Inter. This is what Next.js comes built in. So inside of the layout, you see we are using Inter as the font. So there's you can use any other font if you want. This is just the way that it is being used, and it's already using this Inter.class name. This is using the Next font package that allows you to bring in any Google fonts or your local fonts to your Next.js apps in an optimized way that doesn't have cumulative layout shift. Again, there's going to be videos either on Kyle's channel or my channel about each individual concept we talked about, such as the font package. So search up for the relevant videos. I'm going to include links to the most important parts in the description so you have an easier time finding them. But if there isn't, just go ahead and search either one of our channels for this relevant content. Now, the app structure, I already explained that it's our components are going to be inside of a UI in the components. Again, this is a bit small, I apologize. And that's it. Now we can go ahead and add a component. So inside of our components here, as you can see, there are different components that we're going to use. For example, if we come to the button to use a button, it shows you the code for this button. You can then install this, which is going to then copy this from shadcn to your internal application. So let's try this pnpm code. So let me close this up and then try the pnpm. So again, pnpm dlx shadcn UI at latest, add button. If you know what specific component you want to add, you can pass the name of it here, like the button that I have passed. If you don't know, or if you want to add multiple components together, just run the add command. This is going to open up a selector for you that you can just use the arrow keys to go up and down, select the component that you want. For example, here I want the button, and then use space to select and unselect an individual component and hit enter to install that specific component. So we're going to, we now have the button. So let's just look at the button from a higher level. Inside of our components, there's this UI folder with the button inside of it, and as you can see here, we have the source code. This is different variants that are defined. We have the button, so you can change anything you want here. It's not really a library in the sense that it's abstracted away from you. It's just right here in the source code, and it gives you great customizability. So that was shadcn, and now let's actually bring in Next themes to introduce light and dark theme to our projects. One thing that I forgot to say, our project also come with a light and a dark theme, which is pretty nice as a developer to have that on your portfolio. And for that, we're going to use the Next themes package. So let's go to Next themes. can select this. It's taking some time to load up. Didn't load properly here. So let's open up this one. It's the GitHub page. So the package is called Next Theme. So you can go ahead and install the package, and we're going to walk through the installation or the config. So Next Themes, pnpm add is going to be similar to npm install if you're using pnpm. Now the next step is to create a global context provider so we can share our themes. The way we do this inside of our Next.js app is to create a providers folder. So inside of our app, we're going to create, we'll just close the terminal. So inside of our components, not inside the UI, but in the components root, we're going to create a component called providers.tsx. This is going to be a client component where we're going to share some context, React context, or anytime that you need to use React hooks or client-side interactivity in Next.js, you need to create a client component with the use of this use client up top. This is going to take in a children, which is of type. Just close this off so you can see what I'm typing. So this is of type children, which is a React node. And what's going to happen here is that we're going to bring in the theme provider from the Next theme package that we just installed. And then we're going to wrap our application with this theme provider here. So let me just get this out. We're going to have this theme provider. Now we are going to pass some settings to this theme provider, and I'm going to explain what we are. One of them is this class. So let me just bring them here. So enable system is going to enable theme provider to read the user preferences from their system. Attribute class is that this package is now going to set a class attribute on our HTML tag between light and dark. So I'm going to show you in our console. The other option is to add a data attribute instead of a class attribute. The reason why we're using class is because with the class attribute, we can tie this into Tailwind, and Tailwind already comes with support for dark variants, so we can easily use that class and the dark variant in Tailwind to design our dark version of our site. So we're going to set that there. The default theme is the system. You can just put light, dark, or whatever you want here. And then disable transition on change. Not sure what exactly this is. I forgot what this is. But nevertheless, it's a prop that you need to pass in here for it to work properly inside of a Next.js application. And keep in mind that Next.js apps are running on the server and then also on the client. So we need to disable hydration or delay the hydration to the client when we are switching between different themes, which I'm going to explain in a second. And then we have to also pass in this suppress hydration warning prop to the HTML to just dismiss this, because we know we don't have access to the user's preferred theme on the server. We're going to store this inside of their local storage, but we don't have access to this on the server. So there's going to be this mismatch that we're going to suppress or dismiss this hydration mismatch. So we have created this global theme. So let's keep that there. Now we're going to bring this providers component back inside of our layout. So let me close everything and show you this pattern. So when we want to, again, share some context provider in Next.js applications, the pattern is to create this providers component, which is a client component, which we're going to put all of our context providers here. Then we're going to come inside of our root layout, and we're going to wrap everything inside of our root layout with this custom client component we just created. And then we're going to pass in the children to this. Sorry. I made this. Okay, like so. So our children are going to be our pages, our nested layouts that are going to this client component. A common question that I get from folks watching this technique is that, well, if this provider's component is a client component and you're wrapping your entire app with a client component, does that turn everything into a client component? And the answer is no. You can pass in server components as children to client components without turning them into client components. If you import a component or a server component to client component, you have crossed the boundary and it turns it into a client component. So imagine that your client component renders and there's going to be specific spots left empty for these server components to be plugged in inside. Or when things are running on the server, we generate the HTML for the server, and then we're going to just put them in the slots that the provider or the client components has there. So you can interleave and interweave server and client components in this way. Again, pay attention to that server components are passed in as a children or as a prop to our client components here, and they're not being imported inside of a client component. And when I say imported, like when you are inside of this file and you import a component here, well, you have already crossed the boundary of client. With this use client, it marks that point on inside of your modules as a client side. So anything imported there would be considered a client component. So that's different from passing it as a children. Just a little note on this difference, if in case you didn't know. And then the last thing is that, as I mentioned, we have to pass in this hydration mismatch. So there's this suppress hydration warning. We know there's going to be a mismatch between what we render, specifically the class and data attributes that the Next themes package is going to set on the HTML. There's going to be a difference between what is rendered on the server and potentially what we get on the client, depending on the user preference that comes from their local storage and their system preferences. So we're going to just ignore or dismiss that hydration warning there. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's create a theme toggle button that we can then include inside of our application to then toggle the theme. So let me just create this component. I'm going to have a theme toggle TSX. So theme toggle. Now we're going to use the use theme package or the use theme hook from the package we just installed. Let me just copy this part of the code actually and explain, because it's not that hard over here. So let's save this up. So the theme toggle, this is going to be export default function. Sorry. So export default function theme toggle. So we're going to use the use theme hook from the Next themes package. This is going to give us a function to set the theme and then the resolved theme. Now this is going to be the result of whatever is resolved from user preferences and the system. So we know if it is dark or light. Now we're using this use mounted to only render this theme toggle if this component is mounted. Again, Next.js components are also going to run on the server, and we don't want to run this on the server because we don't have access to the theme. So if the component is not mounted, we're going to return. Otherwise, we know we're on the client side, and then we render this button. So this is using this use mounted with this use effect to set mounted to true for the first time that it runs. If you're not mounted, we return null. Otherwise, we return this button. Now, this is the first button we're using from the shadcn package. You can pass a size on, as I'm doing here. There are different variants on the buttons. You can read the docs for it. The ghost is when it doesn't have any background. When you hover over it, it has a background. You're going to see it in a second. And then on click, I'm going to say if the resolved theme is dark, we'll then set the theme to light. And otherwise, just set it to dark. And I'm using different icons, a sun icon if the theme is dark, and a moon icon if the theme is already light. So that's the button, and that's the toggle theme. The theme toggle, we're going to bring this inside of our header, as you saw inside of our app, to allow the user to toggle the theme. Now with this out of the way, let's actually go ahead and create some shell for our application. So inside our components, we're going to create a header.tsx. So let's export a function here called header. Save this up. We're going to come back to this, and then we're going to have also a footer. This is our global header and footer for our website. Save this up. Bear with me for a second. Okay. So inside of our header, let's just copy this. I'm going to copy the code that doesn't require that much config to make this a bit faster. I could just code this one by one. I assume you already know how to style most of this stuff. The hard parts we're going to code together, but the header and the footer, I think it should be pretty straightforward. I'm going to change this to say add components and then the theme toggle. Let's see. Okay, we have the export default here. I don't have it as the default export. Okay, so header, again, a header component, a nav, a div for our logo that goes to the home page, a UL with some unordered lists, going to posts, going to projects, going to contact, and then at the end I have a theme toggle. I've set this container as a flex, display flex, so that it just displays them all across. Now, one thing about the container, let me just show you. When you install shadcn, it actually sets this container class inside of your Tailwind config. So inside of your theme, the container, this allows you to set container class. It's going to center whatever div you pass this class on. You can pass in paddings. By default, it doesn't have any center or padding, so you can add it as I have added it over here. So that was our header. And then for our footer, similar concept, we're just going to add some stuff. So let's go to footer and replace what I've built here. So one thing that I have here is I have a list of socials or navigations here that you can use. You can put in your own socials, Facebook, Instagram. I've put it LinkedIn, Twitter, GitHub, and YouTube if you have other socials that you want to create inside of your footer. And for each one, we are rendering an icon with the name and a link that goes to your socials, as again you saw in the application we looked at together, which we don't have it here, but we're going to create this in a second. So with this footer out of the way, let's just go back to our layout and actually bring this to our components or to our page. So let's close this. Let's go to our app and layout. I'm going to copy these components over here. Okay, so what I've done here is that I've brought in the root layout, again, the header and the footer, and then what I did on top of what we had before is I turned the body into a flex container and a flex column. And the reason why I'm doing it is on the pages where we don't have enough content, we don't want the footer to just come up. So the header and then the content and then the footer be sticking right there. I want the footer to go all the way down to the bottom. Just a simple little technique that you have a flex, and then if you grow the main section, which is here, is going to take up as much as room as possible. Sometimes you can do the same effect by putting a margin top auto on that last footer component. Different ways to do it. That's the reason why I'm bringing this extra classes here. But the main point is now we are wrapping our entire app with a header and a footer. We are wrapping the children or the pages inside of a main tag. I've set this grow. This is a flex grow 1 in a flex, so it just expands to take up as much space as there is left. Another thing that update that I had done here is I've also brought in a serif font from Google Fonts. It's called Playfair Display. And the way that you bring in this font is that you import the class from the next font. In this case, it's from Google Fonts. You then create a new instance of this font. You set the subset of the font that you want to bring in, and you can define a variable here. So here I've defined a font serif variable, and then we are passing that variable in our classes. And then inside of our Tailwind, if we go to Tailwind config, we are using this, or if we don't, we have to use this, or we are not using it here. So let me just copy this Tailwind config as well. So anytime you're bringing a new font, you're just going to go ahead and also set it inside of your font family. So let me close this up. So the themes, the container, in the extend, you can see I have this font family. I'm using the same variable font that I have passed in there into my classes on the HTML tag. And I'm using it to say, hey, for sans fonts, use this font that I have set inside of this variable. And for the rest of it, I'm just using the font family or whatever comes by default from Tailwind. So I have one for sans serif and one for serif. So right here, we had the inter. This is going to be our sans serif fonts, and then the play for display is going to be our serif font. I'm setting both here and reading them inside of my Tailwind to extend the font families to now use that. Now, when you do this, now you can pass in font sans and font serif as your class name in Tailwind to then apply that font to your titles, just as a design for our site. So our titles can have serif fonts. I have added this over here. Now in Tailwind, there's going to be packages here that we haven't installed yet. We're going to talk about this. So ignore them for now, but we're going to talk about this Tailwind packages and typography package specifically later on. So we have our shell. We have added our header and footer. And now let's just render our site and see if all of this is showing up. So pm dev. Let's go to localhost again. Let's close this off. Okay, so we have some problems here. Okay, yep, Tailwind typography. It is inside of our Tailwind CSS, but we haven't installed it. So let's just go ahead and install it now. I'm going to explain why we need it later on. So bear with me. Just install it now because I copied Tailwind config, and that is already using the Tailwind typography package. So let's add that and see what's happening. Open up a new page. Why not? Seems like we don't have any errors. So let's see if we can see the header up top and the footer down there and the content of our page. Well, one thing that I need to add to my main page over here is to set a maxed width of 3XL. This is how I am doing it everywhere else. So it not only centers them, but it also doesn't allow it to grow more than this 3XL, which is 768 pixels. Okay, so we have the shell of our app, the header, and the footer down with our socials, and our theme toggle button should also work to toggle this. Now you might wonder, where are we setting these colors for the background and for the text? So if you come inside the global CSS, this is where you set your global CSS. Well, with Tailwind, we are passing our styles inside of our components, but if there is any global styles or classes you want to set, you would set them inside of your global CSS. Now, these are shadcn specific CSS variables or CSS colors that you can use to customize any theming that you have. So we are setting some CSS variables, and down in the bottom you can see we are applying the BG background and text foreground to our body. And then depending on if we are on the dark class or on the not dark class, we are changing this background and foreground CSS variables, which in turn just switches the light and the dark theme. Okay, So we have our application shell working. Now let's work on our intro section, which is a little about me section inside of our app. So component, let's call this intro.tsx. And again, this is not that big of a deal of a component, so I'm going to copy, assuming that you can already replicate this easily. So a section that has some description and an image. Now for the image, we are using a local image that we are hosting with our application. So inside of our public, we have to create an images folder. And then inside of it, we're going to have authors. And then we're going to have other folders such as posts. This is going to include the posts or images that we're going to use for our blog posts. We can have another one for our projects, just for organization. Now for the authors, let me just copy the image that I have. So public images authors, and let me just copy this into the authors. So that is going to work there. So we're using the next image component. We're importing this as a static import, passing it as the source. You can pass in width and height. If you're importing a static image like so, you don't need to pass in width and height. I've just set it here for good measures. I've set the priority tag on it because if you don't, next image is by default going to lazy load your images. Because I know this image is going to be in the hero section, I've set priority to disable the lazy loading. So that's that. Now with this, we can just go back inside of our home page. So let's close this off, app and page. And let's just, instead of this portfolio, let's just bring in our intro section from our components. Let's save this up and hopefully that is going to show up over here. Now I don't see the titles being rendered correctly, so let me see why this problem is happening. On the title, okay, we have a class of title to combine some CSS classes together. So let me just show you how we would do this, because sometimes you may want to have global class names even though you're using Tailwind. So let me just come here. Okay, so I've added some classes over here. This body that we have already seen is what comes when you install shadcn, but I've added this title, as you can see here. And I'm saying for the title class, anytime that I add this class, we want to apply these Tailwind classes. Font serif, this is the extension we added to our Tailwind config with the serif font. Text re-excel, font bold, underline, decoration, border, and whatnot. So I'm applying all of these Tailwind classes to this title class. Now this pros pre, these are for when we want to syntax highlight using the Tailwind typography. So we're going to get back to that, but you get the idea. Anytime that you want to work with the actual classes, you can just actually come in here, use a base layer, and just apply directly from Tailwind to apply Tailwind classes to any regular CSS class. So with that, you can see that my title already updated with the correct font over there. I don't see enough padding there for whatever reason. We're going to get into that later. But for now, we can continue with adding some Markdown and MDX. We're going to take care of our content setup, some introduction with Markdown, and how we're going to parse that using the two different packages that are available or popular in Next.js to bring that content into our React application. So as an introduction, let me just open up this page. So Markdown and MDX, there is a link or a section in Next.js docs that talks about Markdown and MDX. If you're not familiar with it, it introduces the different packages that you can use. And I'm going to introduce from a high level the packages, and then we're going to use one specifically. So Markdown is a lightweight markup language. It is used to format text. It allows you to write plain text syntax, and then you can convert it using different parsers to valid HTML. So instead of writing this HTML, which is not easy if you're writing your content like this, imagine writing your blog posts with HTML like that. Instead, you can just use markup language like so. So there's special syntax that you can use. It's limited. There's tons of cheat sheets out there in how to use italics, bolds, links, images, and whatnot. And this is going to be turned into that. Now, MDX is now a superset of Markdown. So Markdown is just plain text. So you just write this. It allows you to write some stuff or style it differently or have different markup that turns into links and bold text and whatnot, but it's not interactive. It's just static. Now, the idea for us bringing this into our React world is to also bring some interactivity into our otherwise static content, and that's where MDX comes in. So this is like Markdown plus JSX or plus React components, which is going to give you that interactivity. So you can bring in any React component to your static blog posts, which we're going to do and see how this works at the end. Now, when working with MDX inside of an Next.js app, you have two packages you can use. One is this Next MDX. This is going to allow you to write your pages. Instead of writing a page in page.tsx, you can write pages.mdx, and your pages that define your routes can be in MDX content or JSX content all together combined. And this comes with some benefits and some downsides in the way that we want to use it. There's a different package also introduced at some point here, which is Next MDX Remote. That's the package that I'm going to be using it. The Next MDX Remote is going to allow you to have your content or MDX files anywhere in your application, or you can even store them in a different Git repository. The remote comes from the fact that you can just fetch it like you would fetch any other data. So you would treat your MDX content as data and use the Next MDX Remote to just fetch this remote content, parse them as HTML or parse them as React components or something that React can render, and then pass it to your page components and use them anywhere that you want. In this docs that you can see, there is different sections for how to style, how to share layouts, how to use metadata. Again, we're going to do that all together. Metadata inside of Markdown is typically called front matter. That's the part inside of our post that talks about, so it contains metadata about the post, things like images, authors, the date that it was published. We're going to use a package called gray matter. We're going to see this in code in a second. Just let me go down. Now, before we get to the Next MDX Remote package, we're going to use Remark and Rehype plugins, not directly, but through these packages. These are the two engines that actually parse your Markdown to HTML. Nothing that you need to know, but if you needed to use any Rehype or Remark plugin to bring in extra functionality to your code or to the parsing engine, you can use plugins, and you can pass those plugins, as you can see here, to these packages when you're using them. Now, the remote MDX is the package that we are going to use. It's called Next MDX Remote. This is how or what I'm using on my own portfolio site. It allows you to have your MDX content locally inside your application, inside a CMS, in a different Git repository, in a database, anywhere remotely. Fetch it, parse it, and then render it or pass it, compile it to something that React can render. So simply put, you can use this new RSC, which is short for React Server Component module from the Next MDX Remote to get the MDX Remote package. This is a component. You can pass in your Markdown source to it, and this is going to render it on your server and then render the HTML or the React component out of this. So let's try this as our example or a simple example. So let's install this package, stop the dev server, npm add Next MDX Remote. Let's come inside of our home page and let's create some content here. Let's say this content is just regular string content. Let's go back here. Let's say this is a markdown heading. Why not? Then we're going to bring in this MDX remote. So let's get rid of this React import. And then all we need to do is to bring in this component over here. So let's just drop it in here. Now this needs to be this content. So that's the easiest way to render MDX using this package. Let's run our site and refresh our app. And let's see that content show up here. It's not going to be styled, but at least we can see how this is rendered. So this is our markdown over here. I guess this needs to be like that to be rendered as an H1, because with that, it was just considering that as a text. So if I inspect this in the console, in the elements, we can see this is an H1. So it correctly, that's the way to define an H1. If you want an H2, it's just 2 hashtags. So it is parsing this into HTML correctly. Now we're going to use it in a different way. We don't use it like so, but the simplest way to add MDX using the MDX remote is just to pass the source to this component. But what we need to do is we want to have MDX files where we can write our content, and we want to then compile them and render them inside of our pages. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. So how are we going to do that? So let's create some content folders inside of our directory here. So I'm going to have a folder called content. Then we're going to have some posts. We're going to also have some projects just for organization purposes, so they are different from one another. Now let's create an example blog post. I'm just going to copy some markdown file, and I'm going to explain what this is. So let's create a post called Introduction to MDX, and let's mark this as MDX and copy some markdown files. Let me just show you what this is. So this is a markdown file. Up top with this notation, we can add front matter. It has a title, the summary, an image, which points to where we would store the image for this specific blog post, the author, and a date. The rest is just markup language, texts, headings, code snippets using this triple backtick. And then, as you can see here, I have brought in a component. Now let's leave that for now because we don't have that component, but we're going to add that component later on. And that's where the interactivity comes in, or the benefit of using MDX, which allows you to bring in React components into this. So it's just a static markdown as far as we have here. Now we want to render this blog post that we just created in a dynamic post or slug page. So imagine that when we want to go to this individual post that we create, we have to have a dynamic route here to render that. So we're going to create a folder called posts. Inside of it, we're going to have an all posts page. So page.tsx. So here we're going to render all of our posts. So let's say posts page for now. And then we're going to have a dynamic slug page, which is going to look at the slug and then fetch the corresponding title or slug from our content, compile the MDX into JavaScript or React, and then render it on the page. So page.tsx. Now inside of this dynamic slug page, we're going to receive the slug as the params. So let's write the component. It's going to be the individual post. Now this is going to receive the params object from Next.js. This is going to be of type params slug. And then what we want to do is we want to get the slug out of the params. So let's just destructure this out of the params. And then we want to create a function that says content. Let's say we want to have a function that says get the individual post. So get post by slug. Let's delete that, get post by, we don't have this function, but we're going to create it in a second. So we want to have a function. This is a server component. So you can turn this into an async function and await this. And we're going to just fetch the content of this specific slug based on the file names or the same slug that we have inside of our content folder, and then render it on this page. So this is the idea that we are trying to create here. So let's go inside of our application. So inside of lib, we're going to create a file called posts. And here we're going to create some functions that actually reads the content from our local file and parses it to something React can render. So bear with me here. So inside of our posts, let me just close this off. Okay. So let's export an async function here called getPostsBySlug, which is expecting a string. So let's close this up. So what are we trying to do? Well, first thing that we need to do is to create the file path. So what is the file path that we are trying to get? Well, we're going to use the path package from Node.js, because this is running on the server, so we have access to Node.js packages. And then we're going to use the join function on the path to add the current working directory. This is going to, let's just define our root directory up top here inside of the posts so we can just use them here. So the root directory that we're going to use here to then add everything to is going to be this function that we have here, this value that we have up top here. Okay, so we're going to join the current working directory. We're going to go to the content folder, and in the posts folder, this is what we had here, but the Copilot didn't have this, so I replaced it with the root directory. So this is our current working directory, goes up into the content, into the posts, and is going to be looking for a file name with that same slug name. So the slug that we passed in is whatever slug that it is inside that dynamic route in Next.js. So the user has gone to /posts/introduction to MDX. The introduction to MDX is this slug. We're going to take that, pass it to this function. We're going to create this root directory. So going to our content and attaching .mdx to that slug to then find that file path. Okay, so once we have the file path, we're going to read the content of the file using the fs module. We can use the read file sync, so it doesn't need the await over here, and then we can get the fs module again from our packages. So let me just also import that here. Now this is going to get the file path, and then we can pass in an encoding like so, or you can pass in an object that says encoding and then UTF-8 like so. So this is going to give us the file content. Then we're going to use a package called matter to get the front matter out of it. So the Next.mdx package can also read front matter, but I found it a little buggy when you wanted to parse the front matter as well and then get the content using the compile function. If you're using it on the previous versions of Next.js or the previous versions of Next.mdx remote, where you would use it in the pages router, it works. But on the server, we're going to use a compile function. And for that, I've used the gray matter package, works better. So we're going to install a package, gray matter. This is going to allow us to parse front matter, or this part, out of our MDX. Then we're going to pass the rest to Next.mdx remote to parse as HTML. So let's install this package. pm add gray matter. Sorry. Okay, so with this, let's just close this off, go back inside of our lib folder. Okay, so we're going to call this. Now this is going to give us the front matter, so it's going to give us the data and the content, and we pass the matter from gray matter, and we pass the file content that we just used. Okay, so we got the file path, we read the content of it, and with the matter, we're just getting the data or the front matter, the metadata out, and the content that we need to parse using the compile function that we're going to get from our Next.mdx remote package. So let's just return an object, return an object with metadata that is whatever that we had in the data. That's our front matter. We're going to add this slug as well, and then the content. Okay, so we have the metadata and we have the content. Metadata is whatever front matter we had, so we are spreading over this object. So gray matter is going to just turn this in front matter into an object. So we have an object with title, summary, and image property. So we're going to spread over that, and then we're going to also add slug because we didn't have slug here. We're going to use the slug to then know where to actually navigate, or the links that we want to include, not inside of our individual blog post page, but when we want to create a list of our blog posts, this slug would be useful to just have the link, send them to the correct path. Now, for good measures, let me just wrap this inside of a try catch and actually add some types. So same function we just wrote is going to take a string. It's going to return a promise that is of type post or null, depending on this slug, whether or not it exists. So I wrap this inside of a try catch, so we have some nice error handling. And I've defined some types over here. So a post is containing a metadata and content, which is a string. Metadata is going to be of type post metadata. And this is whatever that comes back from our front matter. So title, summary, image, author, and then added this slug that we added to it. So it is nicely typed. So we have type safety inside of our application. And then inside of here, let's just go ahead and import this from our lib folder. So let me go back to our post page, and then up top here, we are fetching this specific post. If we don't have the content, we're going to call the not found function. We don't have to return this, so we can call not found. We're going to create this page together. So anytime that you want to render a 404 page, or anytime that the user is accessing a slug that doesn't exist in your page, you can just go ahead and call this not found function, which in turn is going to render your not found page. So you can create an individual not found page, and then that will be rendered. We're going to create that in a second. So let's also destructure the metadata out of this. So assuming that we already have a post, this is going to have some metadata because that's what we are returning here. So we have this object that has the metadata and the content. So we're getting the metadata and the content. From the metadata, I'm just extracting the title and the metadata that I need. And then I have the content that I can pass into our MDX remote. So let me just copy this section down here. So instead of returning this div, we're going to return a section with this information. Let's just import this arrow icon left. This is going to be from Radix. When you install shadcn, it automatically also installs the Radix UI icons. Now MDX content is coming from our MDX package. This is again what is going to help us render our MDX component, but this is something custom that I have created. I'm going to show you in a second. So let's create this format date function inside of our lib. We can have this utilities where we export utility functions that is going to help us render our posts nicer. So I'm exporting a format date. This is going to take a date string and use this to local date string function to just render our dates in a nicer way. Now for the MDX content, let's just first use the same MDX remote from RSC. So there is two different components from this package. You would want to get the one with the RSC, which is from React Server Components. So the first thing that we're going to do, or the first way we're going to do this, is to just render this component that comes out of the box from the Next MDX remote. Then we're going to customize this to add our own components. So we know how we can also add custom React components to our MDX content. But let's just go ahead and render the MDX remote and the content that we got back from our backend. So if I now go to my posts, I don't have the all posts page yet. So this is going to 404. Let's see if the development server is running. Yes, it is. So this is going to 404, which we're going to fix in a second. But then I want to go to introduction to not Next.js, but let's say MDX. Now this should render the content of our post because we do have a page inside of our application, or a content really inside of our post with the same slug. So again, what's happening here is that we are rendering this dynamic slug page. This is the slug. So inside of our app, inside of our posts, we had this dynamic slug page. This dynamic slug page gets this slug from Next.js, uses that slug and this get post by slug library function that we created to get the individual post. If it doesn't exist, we're going to return not found. Otherwise, we're going to just get the metadata and render it here. Now, as far as the metadata, it's just a link up top that says go back to the post. If there is an image, we're rendering an image, which is broken now because we don't have an image, but inside of our front matter, we actually said we do have an image. So if you don't have any image, you have to just delete this. And if you delete this, well, up here in the slug page, it says, okay, there is no image. So if I re-render this page, this time inside of our front matter doesn't have any image. So it doesn't render that image. It just renders the title. Down here, renders the author, formats the date nicely here. And then down here, we're just rendering the MDX content. So this is everything that we had inside of our markdown, now rendered over here. Now you might wonder, how are we styling it like so? And that's where the Tailwind typography package comes into place. You see this prose class that I have put in here? If I remove this prose, which is actually what is styling this content, you see this becomes all the regular text content that comes out of our markdown. This is a still turned into HTML. So it's proper HTML. So if you click on like this introduction part, it is an H2. So if you inspect this, all this is a p tag. Well, this is the H2. So it is structured HTML, but it's not styled. So one thing you can do for styling these type of stuff using Tailwind is the Tailwind typography package. So if you go to the documentation and search for typography, there's this plugin that you can use, Tailwind typography, that we just installed. And what this allows you to do is to pass in this prose class to any content that comes from a CMS or Markdown in this case that you don't have access to individual HTML elements to pass in classes. So you can pass in this prose, and this automatically just is going to style them depending on the tags that you have in a nice manner. You can customize how it is styling it by going inside of this prose the same way that I did it inside of my global classes, for example. You can also do it inside of your components. So you can pass in here. I'm saying if there is a pre-tag inside of a prose, do this. If it's a code inside of a prose, do that. There's also more customization that you can do. If you click on this, learn more about the typography package. It also shows you how you can, pass in different or overwrite some of the default for the way that it is styling. So if you can see here, the way that it is styling headings, like so, lists, items, containers, codes, and stuff, so you can override them. But out of the box, it's just nice, in my opinion, and we don't need to overwrite much. So what I'm here saying is that use pros, and I'm just wrapping this MDX content with this pros class. And the way that it works is that when you pass the pros class into the parent component of your content, Tailwind typography package is just going to style them automatically, and that's what's happening here. Now for the dark version, I'm using pros invert, which is going to invert the colors, which is going to allow us to have this nice light and dark theme styled inside of our blog posts page. Okay, so for the image, let's go back. I want to also bring in the image. So let's go up top and bring this image back. Let me also copy the image that I have. So inside of our projects, public images, there's this project. So let me just copy the image that I have. You know what? Let me just copy the whole thing. Let me delete this and bring in all the images all together wholesale, so we don't have to copy and paste. Okay, so we now have this. We added this inside of our front matter. So if I now close this and refresh our app, we should see our image being rendered up top as well. Again, inside of our post blog. The image is just rendering next image component with the source passed into here, and the source is just the path that we defined inside of our front matter. So inside of our content, we've defined this path, which is going to our images folder, posts folder, and then there's a slug with the same name of the slug and whatever image that you want to pass there. So it's rendering that one over here. Now, there's also another way to define or style how this is compiling your components. So let's say up top here, I have some custom components. So for H1, or let's say H2, because I know I have H2 inside of my markdown. So I have H2, and then let's render this as H2. Let's just type this as any for now. So I have this custom components object that says anytime that you encounter an H2 or a heading of type 2, render this specific thing that I'm saying. This is what we can pass into the components prop of our MDX remote component. So this takes in a components that we can just pass in our custom components mapping. So now, anytime it encounters an H2, it's going to render this thing. So let's just pass in a Tailwind class here. So we're going to say text red 400. Now, if I refresh this, you can see all of my titles are now turned into red. So one way is to just use this pros classes, or even together with this pros classes, you have even more control over how this MDX remote package is parsing or compiling your markdown content. In this case, I've just added this H2 component, which is going to turn my H2s into an H2 with whatever children that they had and add this class to it. Now we're going to use this for syntax highlighting, but also any other custom component that we want to pass into our MDX content. So let's actually create a separate component that allows us to pass in these components to our MDX remote and then render custom components. So inside of components, let's create an MDX content.tsx. Let me just copy the code here. This is how I like to organize my MDX content. Let me explain what we're doing here. So MDX content is going to take some props, is going to render under the hood the same MDX remote component that we've been using. But now in this file, I can define some custom components and pass it to my components prop of the MDX remote. Now in this case, I'm not going to use this H2 thing that I created here, but I want to use a highlighting package for syntax highlighting anytime that I encounter a code. So anytime that I have a code here in this function, I want to highlight the children using this highlight package coming from Sugar High. So we're going to install that in a second. And then we're going to use that highlight and then pass it to this code tag. Now I'm going to set this code component to my code HTML tag and pass this component to my component to MDX remote. So I'm telling MDX remote, anytime that you're compiling and parsing my markdown content, if you found a code snippet which is using the triple backtick that we saw earlier, so going to content, if you're not familiar with writing code, this is the code snippet that we have. So it's inside of this triple backticks. Anytime you do this, it marks it as a code tag. I'm here telling MDX remote that anytime that you encountered a code snippet, use this custom code component that's just going to highlight the syntax and then wrap it inside of a code component. Now here I'm going to use an example counter component and add this to our MDX as well, just to show you how you can pass in regular React components, not necessarily HTML tags, but regular React components also to your compiler to then render React components or bring interactivity to your static markdowns. So let's install this Sugar High so we get rid of this error. So pm add Sugar High. And then inside of our components, we have this counter, which we're going to pass in again. So let's create this counter as well, tsx. This is just a regular React component with some counter state. Okay. So it's going to render a button that just increments and decrements a count state. Something pretty straightforward, but the point is bringing this into our static markdown using MDX, which is the whole point over here. So this needs to preload maybe to just read this newly created component here. Hopefully the error is going to go out. So this MDX content we created from a high level again, it is going to have some custom component mapping. Whether they are regular HTML tags or our own custom component, we provide this component object, map all of them together, pass these components to the underlying MDX remote component that comes from the MDX remote package that's going to take the markdown, take this component mapping, and then generate the output that React can render. Okay, so let's go back to our slug page, and down here inside of rendering the MDX remote, we're going to now render the MDX content package or component that we just created. So MDX content, that's now using our mapping for syntax highlighting as well as that counter component. So let's pm dev and refresh our app. Okay, so we have our code back, but on top of it, what happened is that now we have added this syntax highlighting to our code. So this is now again using this custom code component we created, which tells MDX remote anytime you encounter the code snippet, just do this or use this, which is using this Sugar High syntax highlighter to highlight the syntax of our code. Okay. Now, in terms of the custom counter component, so let me just go back inside of our content, posts, and here. Why use MDX? Let's just bring in our custom component here. So I have this counter. Now, this is not your regular JSX or TSX file, so you don't have to import it up top. You just put your component over here, and what tells MDX or what makes this work is this custom component that we passed in here. So we are importing this counter component, which was a regular React component with the states of the counter to go up and down or to increment and decrement the counter. And we are telling MDX remote that anytime you're parsing our HTML, if you encountered a counter component, so when MDX is going through this, it encounters this counter component and says, okay, if you saw this, well, you have to render this component, this React component that I have imported here. So don't get confused, just render this one. And if I refresh the page, now I have to see this counter component brought in here, which is a React component. So you can bring in any functionality you have in your React into your static content. And this is the power of MDX, which is JSX inside of your Markdown. Now, let's just quickly look at this spacing here. As I mentioned in the beginning, inside the global CSS, I've set some classes that applies our tailwind classes to our pre-tags and code tags inside of our pros. You can override how tailwind is rendering this. I'm setting some line heights here, so you can pass in a smaller line height, for example, line height, or it's called leading actually in tailwind, leading 3. And that's going to reduce the size of the line height. You can also pass in different paddings to each of these lines to get the feel and look that you desire, or even change these colors. Now, as far as the syntax highlighting goes, these are the CSS variable classes that the SH or sugar highlight reads. Again, you have some customizability over this. So for the identifier, for the keyword, for the strings, read the documentation or play around with these CSS colors to get the look and feel that you want. This is a very light package that allows you to highlight your codes in a very performant way. It actually works also on both sides because it is using CSS variables that you can flip based on the theme that you have, which is going to give you a nicer look for your blog post. Okay, next let's build this all posts page that we currently don't have. So here, let me close all of this. Let me actually close the terminal. So inside of our app, we have these posts. We've been working on this individual blog post or this log dynamic page. Now let's go to this all posts page. Okay, so let me bring in some components here. And to begin with, we're just going to render the posts here. So let's create a component here that has posts. This is going to just be a list of all of our posts. So component, let's just create posts.tsx. And this is going to get an array of posts and then return an unordered list with some links that reads the slug for that individual post and then shows the summary, the title, the date, and then allows the user to click on and then go to that individual slug ID post. So let's come back here. Let's just import this posts. We're going to add this search functionality later on. Now, to get all of our posts, we need to add this function inside of our lib. So in posts, we want to update this. And now we want to have a function that not only gets one post by the slug, instead, it just reads the content of our post folder inside of our content and returns the metadata for all of the files there. So I'm going to create two functions here. One is get metadata, and then the other one is going to be get posts. So let me paste them here. So let's see what we're doing here. Let's start from the get posts. Now this is going to get a limit. So this is how many posts we want to get, and if we don't set anything, it's not going to slice or limit the number of posts we're returning. We're going to use this later on when we use this same function in our home page. Instead of fetching all of our posts in the recent posts section, maybe you just want to get the last 3 posts or the most recent 5 recent posts. So that limit is there. So you can ignore it for now. Now we're going to read the contents of our root directory. Again, the root directory is the current working directory content and then posts. So we're going to read all the files there, and for each file inside of this files array, we're going to call this get post metadata on that file, which is going to do something very similar to what we were doing before. So it gets the file, it creates the slug from that, and then reads the content of the file, and then extracts the front matter and just returns the metadata. Now, before, when we were reading the get post by slug, we were also returning the content. Here we only need the metadata. Remember, this is the all posts page, so we only need the metadata for each post, such as the slug, the title. So we can render a list, then the user clicks on it to land on the individual post. So we're only returning the metadata that contains the data in this slug. So for each file inside of this content folder or inside of our posts in the content folder, we're getting the metadata. Now, on top of that, I'm also sorting the posts depending on the published date. So I want to get the most recent ones. Once I parsed everything, I'm going to sort this array based on the published date. And if we have passed a limit to this function, we're going to get the top 3, top 5 most recent posts. Otherwise, I'm just returning the posts. Okay, so going back to our posts page, now we are fetching this. I'm not passing in any limit, so I need all of the posts. And once I have the posts, I'm just going to pass them into this posts component that is going to render all of the posts. So let's refresh, and you can see we have one post that we have created already listed here. So let's just create some more posts, or at least one more post here. Let me just copy another MDX file that I have created before. So inside of our posts, I'm going to bring in another file. This is introduction to Next.js. Again, it has some front matter and then some markdown with JSX content, pretty similar to what we had before. And now with that, if I refresh, I've just added the content. It looks at whichever that's most recent and sorts them based on that. And that's how easy you can add content later on. So once you have deployed your portfolio, later on you want to add blog posts, you're just going to come to content and create a new file with the slug that you want, and then write the content in Markdown. If you're using any custom components inside of your Markdown, such as this counter we were using here, just remember to create this counter component and pass it to your MDX content component. This is the mapping you need to provide for the compiler to know what the heck this counter you're talking about inside of your content really is. Because other than that, it has no idea of this counter. So that's the workflow for creating blog posts. From a high level, again, if I want to close all of this down, if any of this confused you, so inside of our app in the posts, we had this slug page. What we were doing here is we're reading this slug that's passed to us from Next.js. We are calling this get post by slug, which in turn is going to go and find this slug inside of our content folder, which is this folder. And then it's going to read the content of this file, is going to parse the metadata out of it using the front matter or the gray matter package that we used. And then it's going to return the metadata plus the content, the string, the markdown string, which we're going to use and pass to our MDX content component down here as a source. That's the content. The MDX content component is a custom component we created that is rendering MDX remote that we got out of the Next MDX remote package. We pass in the source or the markdown string as well as some component mapping if we have any custom components. And this renders our MDX. So this is what we have done so far. And now what I want to do is to add a search to this post page so we can search based on the titles of this individual blog post. So let's go to our app posts and this all posts page. So we want to replace this with post with search. So let's create this component. We're going to say posts with search.tsx. And now instead of rendering the posts directly, we're going to render this posts with search here. That all it does is rendering an input and a button that resets that input. So if you're holding a local state of whatever the user is typing, and then we're rendering this posts underneath. So let's bring this back inside of our app. So now instead of the posts, we're going to run this posts with search. Now inside of this post with search, we are using the input component from shadcn, and we need to install that. Again, to install that, you run pm dlx shadcn -ui, add latest, add, and then input. This is going to directly add the input. Again, if you wanted to add a couple, you can just run the add and then select what you want. So now we have the input. So very simple. We have a state for our query. Anytime the user types inside this input, which is from shadcn, we are updating the state with this onChange handler. And then we're receiving the posts. This is all the posts that we got from this server component. So this all posts page was a server component. We turned it into an async function. Server components can be async functions. You can just await data right inside of your server components. That's the beauty of using server components. You don't have to write APIs like your regular way of fetching data in client components. You could just fetch whatever data you want right here inside of our server components, and this code stays on the server, so it's safe as long as you're in the server land. So we fetch the posts and pass this posts array to this component. This is a client component because we need client-side interactivity. We need that input, we need the local state, and depending on what they're typing, we're going to filter our posts. We're going to turn the title to lowercase and the input, the query, to lowercase, and see, and only filter the posts that their title includes whatever it is that we're typing there. If the filter length is more than 0, we're going to render this button that allows us to then reset the filter. So this is filtered. We're using it down here to just render this button. So as you start typing here, not working, so let's refresh. As you're typing here, this reset button shows up. Just it looks to see if there is any query length, so anything that's typed here. And once you click on this, it calls this reset filter, which then sets the query back to nothing. So it just cleans up this input. So it is only working with this one state, and whether or not the user has typed anything in it, and then filters the post based on the title. So if you search for MDX, it brings that up. If you search for Next, brings that up. So it's a client-side search in that we are fetching all of our posts and then applying this filter on top of it. Another way, if you wanted to render this dynamically, is to set this as a query parameter up in the URL, send this back to the server, and use that query parameter to only read the files and compile as needed depending on the search query. This way is better for an individual portfolio site, filtering on the client side where you have all the posts, because we are reading the file system, which can take up some time, instead of dynamically adding or using that search query to compile files from our local system and then render them here. We have them here. We're just going to filter the arrays over here. So there's different ways that you can send. Again, there's videos on my channel talking about search and pagination in React Server Components using the pattern that I just explained. I'll make sure to include links in the description so you can find useful information if you wanted to apply a different pattern. So we added this search to all posts page. We added another blog posts. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention before we move on from this dynamic individual pages is that by default, when you have a dynamic slug route, if you're familiar with Next.js and how it works in the pages router, for your dynamic pages, you had to import or export another function together with the get static params that was called get static paths. That was telling Next.js for what paths do you want to generate these pages statically. Now, in the app router, it's a bit different. So this page right now is dynamic in that we haven't told Next.js what to generate statically, because Next.js doesn't have any idea of all the pages that are possibly existing in your app. So we somehow need to tell it what posts or what slugs do exist inside of our app. And we do that by a function called generate static params. This is the equivalent of get static paths inside of Next.js. So generate static params is going to return an array of params objects that tells Next.js, hey, we know we already have this content, so why don't you go ahead and generate all of this content, all of these pages on the server at build time. So when the user visits these pages, they don't have to wait for this to be dynamically fetched and rendered, so we have them statically. So it's going to increase our performance of the pages by statically generating these pages at build time. So let's get these functions. So what we're doing is we're using the same get posts function we just created. We're getting all of our posts and we are mapping over posts, and then for each one we are returning an object with a slug that sets to post.slug. This is an array of slugs. The syntax is a bit different from the way that we used to do it in the previous versions of Next.js. But never mind if you're new to it, so you just pass a slug. And the reason why we're calling it slug is because we called this dynamic folder slug. So this is looking to replace this dynamic values with some static values coming from this array. And for everything that's returned from here, the pages will be static. If there is a page existing in your app that's not returned from here, it's not going to error out. It is still going to run this function, run this page component. It's going to go ahead and fetch that specific post by slug, and it's going to render it out, but it will be dynamic, meaning that it will be at runtime, at request time instead of the build time. So it won't be static, it will be dynamic. So a little note about the dynamic versus the static generation of these pages. So now that we have our posts and we have the all posts page, why don't we create the recent posts component inside of our homepage so we can just render that section inside of our landing page. So let's go back here inside of the components. We're going to create recent dash posts.tsx. Let me copy some code and see what we're having here. So recent posts. It's a pretty simple component. Let me just close the terminal again. So here we're calling the get posts function. This time I'm passing a limit. I'm saying I only need 4 most recent posts. And then I'm just rendering it in the same posts component that just takes in a posts array and renders a list. And then down here, I just have a link that goes to the all posts page. So let's bring this component back inside of our home page. So in the app, in the home page, let's just get rid of this MDX remote. That was just for the test, so I can get the recent posts. And I can also delete this content over here. So if I now go back to my homepage, hopefully we'll see that recent posts section added here. Again, it renders the 4 most recent posts with a title and then a link down there that takes us to the all posts page, from where we can either search or go to an individual post page, which we have already rendered using the metadata and the MDX remote package for rendering this content. So in a very similar fashion, we can also add paths for our projects. It's using the same concept that we are using for the posts, but this time for projects. So I'm going to create a page inside of my projects folder. This is going to be all the projects. So we're going to create a function that calls get projects. This is going to go and read the content of our projects folder inside of the content and render a project list. And then for the slug, again, we have a dynamic page with the same functionality, getting the slug and fetching that specific project by that slug, and then rendering the content just like before. So it's the exact same thing, but this time it's just reading the content of our project. So inside of our content, we had these projects. Let me add some files over here. So content, and let me bring in the projects that I have, e-commerce, and then Next.mdx. So 2 dummy projects. We already have the images, so the last thing we need to do is to create our lib functions that actually talk to this project. It's again very similar to what we had in the posts, but this time it just reads the projects folder. So let's go ts, let's copy these files. Let me explain what we're doing. So we could have used the same functions we've defined in the posts functions. We could have made them more universal by passing in a directory to them and defining what directory they need to read this slug from. Because the only thing different from these files, these functions, from the functions that we have already had in the posts, the only difference is just the root directory. Everything else is the same. The only difference is that for the posts, we are reading the content of the posts folder inside of our content. For the projects, we're reading the projects folder inside of our content. For the simplicity, I just separate them into 2 different files. Again, you can define these functions to take in the directory and the slug, and then depending on the directory, go to that specific directory and read the content there. The rest is the same. So get project by slug, get all projects with a limit, and the project metadata, so we can render the same similar list of our markdown content for our project. So if we're not going to just do that, it's the same thing that we've already created. So we can just go ahead and inside of our projects now, we have this file. So if I go to the projects now, hopefully we should see some projects. Okay, we don't have the projects component, so let's bring in the projects component as well. Bear with me for a second. Okay, that's the projects folder. And what this does is that it takes in all of the projects, renders a list in a very similar fashion. The only difference is that we're adding these images instead of having the title and the text and the summary. We're having these images and we're adding this hover effects that shows the detail of the project once the user hovers. And once we click on them, it goes to that individual project page. Similar to our posts page, it's just rendering the content of the MDX there. Click on the other one. Okay, so it's rendering the image, the title, and the content of the page in a very similar fashion to our posts page. So now we have our posts and the projects page. We can also create the recent project section. So let me just bring in the recent project and add it here. Now recent projects again is going to call the get projects, pass in 2. You can pass in whatever projects or 4, for example, to here. Get 4 recent projects and render them inside of this list. So let's go back inside of our home page and also bring in this recent projects or recent projects. So save this up, and now if we go back to the home page, we are seeing the recent project section too. So we had the intro, we had the recent posts, and now we have the recent projects. Now, before we move on to the contact page, I want to add the not found or our custom 404 page. Again, the not found is going to be rendered anytime that the user is trying to access a URL that doesn't exist in your application. It also is going to render anytime that you call the not found function, just as we called it inside of our dynamic pages. So let's go to one of them, for example, the post slug. Inside of our post, when we got this slug and called the get post by slug, if this post didn't exist, we called the not found function. So the not found page that we're going to create is going to be rendered anytime you call this function. You don't need to return this because this automatically throws an error and shows that not found page. But it also is going to render the not found page anytime the user is going to access a URL that doesn't exist. So let's bring in the not found page. You need to pass that in the root layout of your application. So let's go inside of the app here. We're going to create a file called notfound.tsx, exporting a default function from here that says 404. if you don't know what you're looking for, and a link to go back to the homepage. So here, for example, if I go to posts and let's go Next.js MDX, and let's add another S at the end. So this doesn't exist. So it renders a nice custom 404 page and a link for us to go back to the homepage. So that's the not found page. Nice error handling for what's going on inside of your application. It also, if for whatever reason this hasn't been generated statically and this is running dynamically, so there's a specific block or slug that they're trying to access hasn't been returned from your generate static params, which means Next.js is going to dynamically render this page. And for whatever reason, if this function encounters any error, because this is reading the file system and then parsing the content dynamically at request time, we have wrapped it inside of a try catch. So if anything goes wrong and we return null from here, this doesn't exist. So we call the not found page. It is kind of an error handling for your dynamic pages. If you have already exported this from your generate static params, this is going to run at build time. So on runtime, at request time, users won't see this. They would just get the static content. But just so you know, the use of this function and the not found page, which can be used for handling errors in your dynamic pages. So with this out of the way, let's just go to the contact page. So we're going to create a folder called contact. And then here we're going to create a page.tsx for our contact page. Let me just look inside here. We're going to render a server component first. And then from here, we're going to render a contact form, which we're going to create together. This is going to use React hook forms to render our form elements, and then Zod for validation so we can verify the inputs. And then we're going to use a server action to handle the form submission. So let's go ahead and create a component called contact form.tsx. So let me explain what we're doing here. It's a bit of code here. Bear with me and I'll explain what's happening from a high level here. So as I mentioned, we're using Zod and React hooked forms. So let's just go ahead and copy these libraries to get rid of these errors before we move on. So let's add Zod. I know Kyle has a fantastic video about Zod validation on the channel. So if you're not familiar with that, you could use that video. We have this Sonar. This is for toast notification from shadcn. So let's go to shadcn and I can quickly show you that inside the docs or components. There's this toast notification called Sonar. This shows, if you look at the bottom below, I'm not sure if you're seeing it or not. I'm covering it with my image. But it shows a toast notification. We will see it in our app too. And to add it, you would just add in like so pm dlx shadcn and add Sonar. This is going to add Sonar for us. Then we're going to use the React hook forms. This is a library that allows you to optimize your form rendering so it doesn't refresh or it doesn't re-render your Next.js or your React app anytime that the user puts or inputs or changes the content of the form. So let's add React hook forms. Again, there's going to be videos hopefully linked in the description for you to watch. I have a dedicated video on my channel about React hook forms with Zod and server actions. So if at any point the stuff we're talking about here doesn't make sense or you need more resources, search Kyle's channel or mine to find more videos about that. So for our forms or for our Zod validation, we also need to define some schemas. So let me bring in some schemas inside of our lib folder. We're going to define some schemas in a file called schemas. So we have two schemas. The contact form schema, I'm expecting a name field, an email field, and a message field. They're all of type string. The name has a minimum maximum character. The minimum one is the way to say this is required. and then minimum 2 is saying that the name at least needs to have 2 characters. The email is of type string, and you can also pass in the verification of email function to make sure this is an email or a valid email, as well as the message. We're going to have this newsletter form schema later on, which has the email. That's for the newsletter component later on, but we're going to define it here anyways, so we get it out of the schemas. Now we need the text area and some actions for this form, so we're going to create that. But let's bring in the text area. Now that we are here, let's go to text area and copy the pm packet or the pm script, add the text area. Okay, so let's reload this page and let's comment this server action for now. We're going to get to this a little later. This is where we're calling that server action. Let's just comment this out and just send a toast notification for now once we submit the form. So let me show you from a high level what's happening. From React Hook Forms, we're getting this use form hook. This is going to give you all the goodies and functions that you need to hook your form up. Now for validation, we are using Zod resolvers. So this is another package that we're getting from this hook form resolvers specifically for Zod. There are different schema validation tools that you can use with React Hook Forms, Zod, Yup, or some more. I like Zod, and it comes with a resolver already for our React Hook Forms, and I'm passing in some default values to name, email, message as strings. Now this use form is going to give us back a form that contains useful functions like as register, handle submit, reset, form state for errors, and the loading state, which we're going to use to hook up our fields. So here, ignore this SVG. This is just the background pattern on the form. We have this form component over here. For each individual input, like the name, I'm using the register function to use that name field, and I'm just spreading over that register. This is going to give the proper value and on change methods and on blur methods set up on this input for us. So instead of having to do that manually, this takes care of all that. Now the name field is coming from our schema. So this use form is working with this form inputs, and inputs is a type we inferred from our schema inside of our schema. As we saw earlier, we've already defined the field. So we have a name, email, and message. So that register down there was coming from that same schema of name. If I have any errors on the errors object that I got out of the form state up top here, there's going to be a property called with the same name property. So it's name and then a message. So if it exists, I'm going to show the error message. And similar for the email, I'm registering the email and I'm showing the error here. For the message, we're using a text area. So we register the message, show the error over here, and that's it. We have a button for submitting that's changing the text inside of it to is submitting and contact us depending on the loading state of our form, which is exposed again from the use form function. Easy to do, and a privacy policy kind of link or note at the end of our form. So that's how you hook up your inputs. Now, in terms of handling form submission, you would pass in this on submit event handler. Now the use form is going to give you back a handle submit function that you need to pass, call, and then pass in your own custom function. So we have defined this process form. This is a function where it's the logic of what we want to do to handle this form submission. In this case, we're going to send an email to the user and also to ourselves to say, hey, somebody is trying to contact us. Now we're going to create this server action. But before that, let's just test this out and everything should work, because once the form is submitted, the handle submit is going to make sure that our form passes the validation that we have defined depending on our schema. And only if it is verified and it is valid, it's going to then call this process form. It's going to prevent the default, so we don't have to do it here. It also passes that verified data to us, so we can use it to pass it to our server action, which we're going to create in a second. So right now, this contact form should work. We have the page contact. So if we go back to our application, if we refresh our app to make sure we have the running dev server. So let's pm dev, also close the terminal. Let's refresh this, and this should bring in our app over here. Okay, great. So if we go to the contact page, now we should see the contact form, the background patterns. It's very slight, but you can see at the back there, just as I mentioned here, this background pattern, it's something that I learned from Tailwind UI components, so you can use it. Now, if I go ahead and try to submit this form without any of these fields, Zod validation is going to kick in and say, these are required. As I start type in my name or email, in this case, their messages go ahead and let's say hello there. And if I submit the form, it resets the form, but it also needs to send in this toast notification. Now, for this toast notification to work, we need to add a provider component to our app. So if we go back to shadcn, I forgot this step, or to explain this step of the process. So into the components, in the Sonar component. So what you need after installing it is that you need to pass this provider component to your entire app. In this case, in the root layout, I'm going to put it inside of my providers component, because this is also a provider. Again, that provider's client component we created in the beginning is a good place to share any context provider that you need to have global access in your app, and the toast would be a similar concept to that. So let's go to our providers component, and I'm now going to bring in this toaster too. So let's go to our providers, if I can find it. Okay, so let's just replace this. And all I had added here is this toast provider, which is a custom function I defined down here that uses the toaster coming from Sonar, but also passes the theme to it. So the reason why, instead of just passing the toaster down here, just like it is showing in the docs for shadcn, is that I also want to pass the theme. So because you can pass in themes to your toaster, there's different options you can pass in. I would recommend reading the documentation here, the different options. For example, you can pass in the position of this toast notification. For me, it's top right. It can be down right or center. You can pass in different colors or even style it all together customly. So read the docs for that. But just to pass in the theme, I've created this custom component that I'm then providing it inside of my providers, which wraps my entire app. So with this now added, if I go back and refresh the page to get the Resend code, and hopefully if this time we go ahead and add a proper email, or a dummy email in this case, and then contact, we see that toast notification showing up top. You can also add the close button if you wish to have a close button. Sorry. So this autocomplete sometimes gets in the way. So close button. So if you pass this prop, then your toast notification is going to have a close button like you see there that you could use to close it. I didn't use it because it doesn't look nice on the dark theme, I guess. You can customize the way that it looks with CSS styling. You have great control over how it looks. I just didn't want to customize that. So nonetheless, that's the contact page. So it is working in that the React hook form is hooked up. Our schema validation kicked in and works. Now we need to use a server action to actually handle this form submission. So the traditional way of handling form submission is that you would create an API endpoint. You would then have a submit handler on your form that prevents the default and then sends a fetch request, a post request to your endpoint, processes the data, gets the response back, sets some local state, loading error state, and whatnot, which we're not going to use. Instead, we're going to use a server action. Now, server actions are functions you define on the server, but you can then also call from the client. It eliminates the need for that extra API layer. It directs you call a function. That function is from the server, and on the server, you do whatever you need to do there. So the convention for creating server actions is that inside of our app or inside of our lib, I'm going to create an actions file .ts, and here we can just export an async function called send email. You can call this whatever you want, and it can get some data. The data can be of type inputs. This is the same inputs that we're getting from our Zod schema. So let me just bring in that Zod schema in a second over here. We're going to call this the contact form inputs. We need to import Zod. So let's import Zod up top. This is using this Z object from Zod. This is good. The good thing from Zod as well, you define the schema once, and then you can use that same schema to infer types. So you don't have to create types on top of your schemas. You can just infer your types from what's happening there. So let me just bring in this send email instead of this Copilot version and explain what we're doing here. So the first step is we get the data, or we pass the data to this contact form. So here, let me comment this out, back in again. So the send email up top, we commented this out. So let's bring that in, save this up. So what happens is that once our form passes the validation, we're going to call the send email. This is a server action, and we pass it the data. Okay. So inside of our actions, to define server actions in one file, you would create the actions file, and then you would mark it as server actions using the use server directive. Now, there are different ways to define server actions. You can define server actions as functions inside of your server components, and you need to use this use server directive inside the body as the first line of the body of the function. A convention that I like to use to put all of the actions in one file is to create the actions file, as I showed in the lib or anywhere, it doesn't matter, and then use this use server directive up top, which is going to then mark any function you export from this file as a server action, which means you can pass it to client components, call it from your form event handlers, or use it to submit your forms, or any data mutation that you need to do on the server can be done using server actions. They're really cool. They eliminate the need for the API layers, but they also allow you to revalidate the data once the mutations happen. Now, in this case, we're not revalidating any data, but imagine that you're using a form to maybe add a blog post, add an item to a to-do list. Then you need to revalidate the cache to show that newly created to-do item. So you can call revalidate functions. That goes beyond the scope of this tutorial here, but you can call the revalidate functions inside of your server actions to revalidate the Next.js cache and refetch the fresh data from your database to sync your application with your database, or to kind of show the recent changes to your application. So inside of this server action here, the first thing that we're doing as good measures, always, we're going to verify the data that's coming in from client side. Even though we are verifying the data inside of React Hook forms on the client side, we always need to verify the data on the server. So we call the contact form schema and the safe parse method on it and pass the data to see if this matches the schema we need. If there is any errors, this safe parse from Zod is going to just return this error object. There's another function you can call on your schemas, that's parse, which is going to throw an error. The safe parse just returns the error instead of throwing it, and that's what I'm using here. So if the error exists, I'm going to return this object with an error. Now, from your server actions, you can return anything that's serializable, meaning that you can convert it to string. Because again, server actions are functions that run on the server. So anything you return, it's returned from the server to the client. Anything that needs to cross the boundary between the server and the client or goes over the network needs to go in the shape or form of a string. So it needs to be serializable. So in this case, we're just returning an object which is serializable. So we're returning an error. On the client side, I'm saying, hey, if this result that comes back from the send email, just like the responses you send back from your API endpoints, if I have an error, we'll just show a toast with the error notification that says, hey, something went wrong, try again. And if it doesn't have any error, it means that everything went well. And then we show a success message and then reset the form. So back inside of our action, once we make sure that our data is validated, we're going to send resend. We're going to use the resend library to send an email to the user, to ourselves, so that we keep track of this contact form submission. Now, if you haven't used Resend, I have a video on the channel and I will try to include a link in the description. This is a package or a library that allows you to send emails. It's similar to SendGrid if you've used it before, or other packages that allows you to send email. It's from the creators of React Email, which is a package we're going to also use here to design our emails using Tailwind CSS inside of our React components here instead of having to design emails outside. So we're going to use this Resend. Once you get started and create an account, you'd be able to get your API tokens. We need our API tokens to be able to use the Resend package. I've included this example. I haven't, so let's just include that. We're going to have the .env.example. This is the environment variables that you would need to run this. So let me just copy this over here. So we need a Resend API key. So let me just go ahead and log in over here. I'm going to use my GitHub login, I think. So once you log in, you'd be able to go to your API keys, and hopefully it doesn't show my API keys here, but then you can generate new API keys and copy them here. This would allow you to use your Resend. Now, to be able to also send an email, you have to have a verified domain. So if you go to the resend.com, if you go to the docs, let me close this up. There is a guide for a Next.js quick start. So we install the package. So you run Resend. You actually have to install it here as well. So let's stop the dev server, pm add Resend. Then you would create an email. You can just create emails using React. In this case, we are just having an email template here. That's a React component. That's just rendering a div with an h. Just know that when you're creating your emails, you can't just put in any HTML tag, because email providers and email processors or email clients out there like Gmail don't accept some of the HTML tags or CSS styling. So it's a headache designing these emails. That's why the React email package also, it's very handy. It allows you to render or design emails that will be readable by all of the email clients out there. So assuming that we have created an email, whether using the HTML here or any other package or the React email package, which we're going to talk about, we're going to send an email using React and Resend. So inside of our server action here or any server-side code, you're going to create a new Resend. So let me make this a bit bigger. So you're going to get the Resend from Resend. You're going to create a new Resend, passing your API key. And then you're going to use the emails.send, the from, the to, the subject. And then if you're using a React template for your email, you can just pass in this React field, call or bring in the email template component that you just created. That's what we're getting here from our components. Pass the data that it needs. So up top, when we were designing this email template, it needed a first name prop. That's what we're sending here. And then this is going to send an email using your API key with your verified domain. If you don't have a verified domain, for testing purposes, you can send emails from this onboarding resend.dev. and it would only send the emails to the same email that you used to create an account. So oftentimes folks set this up, don't verify their domain, and they wonder why it's not working. So if you haven't verified a domain to be able, because for you to be able to send an email to somebody, you have to send it from a domain that needs to be verified. Now, again, in the docs, there's links to how to verify it. It's very easy. You just add it. It sends you an email. You verify your domain. Sometimes you add DNS records inside your own custom domains to be able for Resend to be able to send emails on your behalf. But if you haven't, just for testing purposes, you can pass this as your from, and the two can only be your own email that you use to generate or create an account on Resend, and that's how you would do it. Now, this, as I mentioned, also integrates with React email. This is how you can create nice emails using React components and Tailwind CSS. So have a look in there as well. So let me just copy my API key, and then we'll go back to our server action, figuring out how we're going to send the email using a template. Okay, so I have added my API key. Let's go back to our server action. We have installed Resend, but we haven't imported it here. So let's go to our actions here and bring in this imports. Okay, now we also need to create these emails. We're going to create this in a second, but let's just talk about this Resend that we are using. On the emails object to send an email, from is my verified email, to would be an array of emails, and this is what our data contains because our contact form had name, email, and message. So we're going to get that email. I have CC'd myself, so while we're sending an email to the user to say we've received your contact form, I want to also CC myself so I know who has been trying to contact us, a subject line, a text version of our email, and also a React version of our email, which I'm using contact form email template, a similar template as you've seen in the documentation that requires name, email, and message to just compose an email. So here, let's just create a component. We're going to call this inside the root. We're going to put all of our email components inside of an email folder here. Let me just copy this. Let's just rename this to emails. So this contains all of our email templates. I have this contact form email. It expects a name, email, and message, and just renders a very simple unstyled email that has an H1 that basically renders back whatever the user was saying, the name, email, and the message back to them. You can, again, style this however you want, or use the React email package to send a custom style package. Link would be in the description to a video that I use React email together with the Resend. So if you're interested in using a more styled email or learning about React email, definitely watch that video. But we're going to use this template to just send our contact form or send our email over here. So let me just bring in this part of the file that's missing, where we need to define the actual resend. So we get the resend from the package, and then we're going to create a new instance using our API form, and this is going to now send an email. So with this, if we go back, this is already hooked up. If I go back to my application and refresh, and if I run the dev server, pm dev, let's open up a new page, why not? If I go to the contact page and pass in my email, and and send. This actually should send an email to us. Now, as you can see, I've received the email, contact form submission. That's the heading, message from name, email, and then the message. You could just shape this or design this however you want. But the point is that this contact form now works. So with the contact form done, let's go back to our homepage and actually create that the new subscriber or newsletter subscriber form. So let me just go to my components and get the newsletter form. We're going to then create this or explain what we're doing here in a second. So the newsletter form is a similar pattern as the contact form that we had, in that we're using React hook forms for our form. We're using Zod for validation, and we're going to use a server action to handle the form submission, render any errors, or a success message. Now, first things first, we need to get the card component from shadcn. So stop the dev server, pm dlx, and then shadcn-ui at latest, and then add card. And then we need a subscribe action inside of our server actions. So what I'm going to do here is to also copy that action, and then we're going to explain what that is doing in a second. So let's go back inside of our server action. And now here, we're going to create a new file. So let's close the send email. Now this file, as I mentioned, it's a repository for all of your server actions with the use of this use server. So any file that you export from here is going to now be called, it's going to be considered a server action, which is a specific function that you define on the server and can call on the client side as well. So before we actually do any of this, so what we are doing here is that we are receiving the data that's passed to us from the newsletter form, again inside of our process form. Exact similar concept as what we had there. The only difference is that in our form here for the newsletter subscriber, as you saw in the beginning, so if I go to Next.mdx portfolio, this is the deployed version of our site. It only has this email. So we have this input email, and then we registered the email. So we had to create a new schema. We already copied this schema. So inside of our schemas, we had this newsletter that only has the email. And we're using the same concepts to hook everything up with this input inside of this form. We register the email. If there's any error, we show the error, and a button that submits. Upon loading, shows the submitting, and then the link at the bottom, and then some titles up top that says subscribe to my newsletter and all that. Once the handle submit is triggered through this and it checks or passes the verification, we end up inside of this process form where we're calling our own server action, which is subscribe, which is a replacement for fetching or posting to our API endpoints. Now inside of this subscribe, we can add this user to our database. We can add them to our newsletter platform that of choice that we are using. If you're using ConvertKit or Substack, or I don't think you can add subscribers to Substack by the way of API, but whatever platform that you're using. I'll have a video accompanied by this video where I would show you how to use Resend, the same library that we use to send the emails. It also has this feature called broadcast, which is going to allow you to manage your subscribers, your newsletters, create audiences, and then send broadcast emails to that. Is going to be a video on my channel accompanying this video. So if you wanted to see that implementation, watch that video as well. It's going to be published probably at the same time as this video, so you can cross-reference if you're interested in my implementation using Resend to manage your subscribers, your newsletter subscribers, and then actually send the broadcast email to them. This is a new feature from Resend that allows you to broadcast marketing emails or newsletter emails to a lot of audiences you can create there, watch that video. If not, use whatever service that you're using to add your subscribers here. So the first thing inside of our server action that we do is to parse the data based on our newsletter schema that we created. If there's an error, we're going to send an error, and if not, this is where we're going to implement the custom logic. So we're going to add a to-do here to say implement MailChimp integration or ConvertKit integration or whatever newsletter management service that you're using there. In this case, we're not going to do any of that. What we can do at the end here is just to return a success true. So this close the loops for our subscribe. Now back here, again, if there is an error, we're going to show an error. If not, we're going to say subscribed successfully, which then in turn goes ahead and also resets the form. So let's just go back to our app here. So now that we have this newsletter form, let's go back to our homepage and actually also bring in our newsletter form. So inside of our homepage, now at the bottom here, I'm going to bring in my newsletter form over here, and then hopefully this will show up here. If we run the dev server, pm dev, okay, so our newsletter form is down there. Let's just give it a try. Hello at hamidbahram.io. Subscribe. Will this refresh the form? It's not quite what we were looking for. So let's see what's going on. So we call the subscribe newsletter form. Okay, so let's just delete that. I don't think the JavaScript was loaded properly because it literally submitted the post request, which is not what we want here. So let me just restart the dev server because we have our server action here. Okay, so let's refresh the page. Okay, now it seems to be loading correctly. So email and then subscribe. Okay, so this time didn't refresh and showed us a success message. And this notifications, you can also manually just swipe up and it goes away. Again, this is hooked up properly with the server action. Whatever logic that you need to implement specific to your own need, you have to add it here. If not, watch the video that I have on my channel linked at the end of this video or somewhere in the description. Kyle would kindly link that up at the end, so you can just jump into my channel and continue this implementation using the Resend broadcast feature. So we're done with all of the pages and all of the components that we need. The last step is to deploy our app. So if you don't have an account on Vercel, you can just go ahead and create an account. And for me, I think I have deployed it here. So I have this Next.js portfolio. So once you create your account, you can hook up your GitHub with Vercel. So it reads through your repositories in GitHub. You can create a new project. It loads your different repos, and then you can pick and select whatever repo you've defined here. Mine is called Next.js portfolio. You can import this. This in turn creates a new project. Just remember, if you're using any API keys like we are in here for the Resend package to actually send the contact form submission email, you need to also provide that as part of the step. And then this goes through an automated process of reading your repo, downloading your Next.js files, installing it, run the build command, and then deploying it, which in turn is going to end up in a page like this, where you would have your deployed package as I have here, and then it is going to give you a live link that you can actually see your website live. This is going to also show up on your GitHub if it is connected With Vercel, the deployment, if you're using Vercel and a Next.js app, it's pretty straightforward. You just need to create an account on Vercel and hook up your GitHub. The rest is just you picking and choosing the correct repository, adding the environment variables and hitting deploy, and it's going to deploy that app for you. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We used Next.js, MDX, Tailwind CSS, and shadcn to build a portfolio site where we can use Markdown to write content from blog posts to also projects that we've been involved in. We added styling through Tailwind typography to automatically style our Markdown content that's parsed and compiled using the Next MDX remote package. We also used custom components by passing in custom components to our MDX content. And that's the benefit of MDX. It allows you to write JSX or React components in your Markdown files, which are static text files, to get the most out of your React functionality in your Markdown as well. We have added a contact form, which was using the Resend package to send the emails. We have managed or added this newsletter subscription form that you can use to add new subscribers to your database or to your newsletter management tool that you're using. But we'll have a video on my channel, which is linked somewhere at the end of this video for you to watch if you're interested in looking at the Resend broadcast feature, which would enable you to manage your subscribers, create audiences, and then send broadcast emails to them. So take a look at that. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.